And fundamentally, I think something that's not really emphasized in those spheres online, which I worked in for a few years, is actually being a nicer person, being a warmer person, being a more genuine person, those day-to-day little bits and pieces, rather than instilling other bits of complexes into one's head.
It gives you the full story about yourself, and it gives you the power of knowing who you are, what you can do, gives you the tools of understanding what you can do to adapt better in the future.
Hey Yuliya.
Hey James.
And hello guys. It's been a long time since we've had a conversation on the Jung To Live By channel. There's been loads of things that's been going on behind the scenes over the last few months, most of it in preparation for Carter 4 of our IPSA professional training course and our launch into the US and into Australia, all kinds of exciting stuff. It's been good stuff.
Yeah.
But today we'd like to have a conversation around some stuff in the Personal Myth Guide. Of course, the personal myth is one of the most talked about conversation topics on this channel. I was wondering, to get things started, Yuliya, what was your initial impression when you first came across the idea of a personal myth?
I thought it was very useful, and I thought that it's not talked about enough on the other Jungian websites and communities.
Or even at all, to be honest. I'd never heard of it before.
I never heard about it before coming across Jung To Live By. And I find it, since doing the exercise briefly, I found it immensely helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely in Jung's works. Like, it's in the preface, the first page of the preface of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He says something like, I'm now in my 83rd year and I'm going to undertake to tell my personal myth. And he says, it doesn't matter, pretty much, this is a paraphrase, but it doesn't matter whether or not it's true or not. All that matters is I tell my truth, my fable. That's a bit of a strange thing, really, isn't it? It's like, imagine, especially in these politically contentious times, to say the very least, the idea of my truth could be a little bit, what the hell do you mean by that? Because truth's a topic that's thrown up in the air, isn't it? But if you look at stuff like neuropsychoanalysis, I think this is really, really useful. The purpose of memory becomes relatively clear. Even it's just like a backbone to moving forward with like a conversation. Memory doesn't exist for us as human beings to chronicle the past. It's not a history book. It's there for an evolutionary adaptive purpose.
Surprisingly.
Yeah, so when we look back, and this is something we spoke about with Steve in one of the recent IPSA seminars, it's almost like looking back, especially to those earliest memories. They're like dreams. There's emotion there, and they're not necessarily truly factually accurate, but they sit there in your psyche to give you a message. And that's where the personal myth begins. That's what Jung was talking about. It's like my collected works and my personal myth. It's like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And anyone can do it. Anyone can do it. So,
would you encourage everyone to do it?
Not if they were happy and well adapted and living their lives as they wanted to live them, but if they felt a calling from within to go inside, to fix some things up, to return back home, definitely. It's from Stephen Pauling's clinical experience, it is the most efficacious exercise, both for self-development, so we'll say the Jung To Live By channel, and also clinically for helping people from their experience. And from what I've seen as well, using it with myself and with patients and helping friends with it too. Definitely. I've never seen anything like it before in my entire life.
Do you think that everyone can do it, or do you think that it has to be in a clinical setting with someone else helping you to understand what you wrote about?
I don't think so. I mean, the Personal Myth Guide, this is my personal opinion, so anyone can feel free to disagree. But personally, I think it's the most useful thing ever written for self-development. Ever. I would challenge anybody to hold up another text and go, this is more useful for the purposes of making someone happier, more content, more at home with themselves, So no, I think anyone can do it. We've seen it with guys in our Discord server. People come in every single day referencing things from the guide, talking about it with each other, and saying that it's really helped them. You know, there's no need for anything else except what's in oneself. So comforting to me, especially in these times where we don't really have much more than ourselves, if you like, locked up inside, with things getting more and more, it's getting more and more.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be a good idea, Yuliya, to go through the preliminary outline that's in the Personal Myth Guide. This was released, this was given to the guys in the Discord server by Steve. Must have been like a year and a half ago now. It was right at the beginning of when Jung To Live By started. People found it really, really useful. Obviously, it's only a few pages out of the full guide, but I think it's a really good starting point for some guys. So if we start off with point 1 then, of how to actually go about doing this. What is it about you that when you look inside about your personality and character that you could not give up without giving up you? I was wondering what you thought about that when you first heard that.
I thought that even having this question in front of you already puts you in a state that's giving you the opportunity to get closer to who you are, which is fantastic. And to be honest, that's not an easy question to answer.
No, it's not.
Surprisingly. And what I found is that with myself and with talking with other people, is that sometimes you do go to your core traits and beliefs, and sometimes you write them down, and then you go over and you write more of your personal myth, and then you look back at what you wrote about this point, and you realize that it was maybe some complexes on the surface that told you that this is who you are.
Such a good point, because I reminded of what I first thought when I first heard that. It was, I'm a hard worker. That was the first thing, and I felt a disconnect on the inside, because I'm like, that's just something I'm saying.
Did you know that at that time?
Yeah, it's like you can almost feel a slight disconnect inside. It's like, I am a hard worker. It's like, that's you as a person. You just do things. Is that it? In what area?
Like
where
an
are your
ant.
interests? That's what, like an ant, or a worker bee, or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. Obviously, it's not just that one point. You know, what can't you give up? And you're like, well, and complex rhetoric comes out. You know, it's only that first point. I like what you said there, Yuliya. It is like a grounding state to be in before carrying on with the process. And
it's something that you can contemplate while writing about your personal myth and going back into the memories and possibly interviewing some of your old friends and family members, trying to find out who you are and who you were, how you acted in the past. And what seemed to be important to you all the way. That's very, very interesting.
Yeah. From lots of people I've spoken to, and myself as well actually, there are events that take place in one's life that before and after, they were kind of a different person. At the very least, at the level of persona, but also in how they identify on the inside. I think it's quite common today with these mass movements of belief systems we see out there, especially the political ones. I am an, whatever it happens to be, and I think people know what we mean by that. But that wasn't who you were when you were born, your potential in your genome. That's just how it might manifest, sort of, maybe in a certain domain. It's not deep enough. And it's like someone's trading away their soul if they allow these ideas and suggestions from the culture to sit on their self-concept, sit on their identity, and guide who they want to be throughout their lives. So that question's an invitation to say, scrape it away. Who are you when you look inside? I like that. I like that a lot. So the second point on there is your earliest memories, no matter how recent or far back, but the earliest nonetheless, would be the place to start with.
This is an interesting one because it seems like you can roughly divide people into groups. Some people do know their earliest or like very early memories sometimes, and some people have no recollection of what happened until they're like 8, 9 or 10.
That's true,
11, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Being in the first category, I don't have experience and don't know how it is for the people who don't have a memory about their childhood. How is it to write about personal myth and whether or not these memories emerge? Did you speak to anyone who was Who's like that?
Yeah, me. Yeah, again, when I first came across the exercise, I've been open about it on the channel before. I couldn't really remember anything much in terms of memory from before I was about 16 or so. It was like it was just childhood, with like a few images that stand out. Obviously, you have a childhood, but really the memories proper came after that point. And I've spoken to loads of people with it, yeah. It's like, well, my earliest memory was when I was 9 or 8 or 10. It's like, so what happened before then? You know? And they know they existed, because they must have done, but there's something missing. So when Steve says in there, it's very specific wording, your earliest memories, no matter how recent or far back, but the earliest nevertheless. I think that's really, really useful, because even one's earliest memory is not where they came from originally. Really, an earliest memory, if we're talking about fact versus, say, a personal myth, would be the moment of conception, or the moment of when memory forms in the brain. But that's not where the self-concept begins. So it's almost like the psyche gives you an invitation of the earliest memory. It goes, start here.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But those earliest memories, I think we said a moment ago, they're almost like dreams. You know, I remember some of my earliest memories where I've gone back to try and speak to people who they involved and try and see, was this factually accurate? It looks like sort of. You know, they're kind of, or their memories blended together or something like that. But mostly there's a meaning, an instinctual meaning underneath to reflect something that I needed to become conscious of when I first embarked on the journey. So it's like anyone can do this. They can sit there and ask for their earliest memory. I've spoken to people who've done this. The psyche gives them a memory, and it's like an invitation. That's how it feels. To go, here you go.
Yeah, it's helping you out to find out who you are, to find out who you were and who you're meant to be. It's giving you all that you need. And it seems like what person needs to do is to accept that invitation, to go in there and start collaborating, and then more and more emerges.
I think so. Okay, the third point in the preliminary outline is follow the through line of your life forward from your earliest memories, passing through as many personally significant memories and events that you can. Consider your life transitions, your friendships, relationships, everything that emerges and gathers around the through line. What emerges will be your personal development thus far and all the stable traits of your personality. To access these, use whatever sensory modalities seem most appropriate. If through internal imagery, internal sounds, visceral states, allow them to form and associate together. Think of it as an Ariadne thread into the labyrinth of your personal timeline. There's quite a lot in that point, isn't there?
It's very instructive.
It's very instructive. It gives you absolutely everything that you need.
Yeah.
The problem is it's quite hard work to do it.
That's true.
You know, passing through everything and gather as much as you can. I think an important point to mention here for the guys, though, would be you don't need to go through everything to make yourself feel better. You know, it's an overall process, and really it's the process of a lifetime.
Yeah, and also just to say real quick, because going through absolutely every single memory in detail, it might be a distraction in itself.
That's true.
Yeah, so I think doing what feels right, going into the memories that feel important is the best way to go about it. And then start from there.
Yeah. It's like that earliest memory can be that start point, that invitation start point. But the psyche will also give you memories as well, say over other ones. And as you go through the process, you'll get more and more and more material coming forward. But those ones, it's almost like the psyche is laying out the different steps in the labyrinth for you. You know, some of them can be screen memories, some of them can be false memories. Those are things that I think are important to talk around. But in general, it is trying to piece together everything that happened. Almost like a biography in that way. At this point, is the way it feels to me. Like laying, like photos of all of your past, you lay out there.
Yeah.
You're like, this is what happened.
Yeah.
So there's a part at the end of point 3 there, where Steve's written, if through internal imagery, internal sounds, visceral states, allow them to form and associate together. I know that you and I by virtue of lots of things, actually, not just typology, but we perceive the world in subtly different ways. You know, one might classically say that you are an ISFJ. In my opinion, I don't know if you would agree with that, if we're to use a Myers-Briggs framework, which we don't normally do, to be fair. It's just a limiting thing. But in that case, I'm wondering how you as an ISFJ would differ in how your memories come forward to, say, myself as an I or an ENTP.
Not sure how they differ, but having a memory emerge from me, let's say from a childhood or from some time in the past, it puts me in the same ego state that I was in when the memory took place. I can feel what I felt. I can see people around me. I can feel the surroundings. And it's very vivid.
I think that's the part where we differ. When it mentions there, say, sensory modalities, the sensory modality I get is sight. That's pretty much it. I won't be able to feel or smell or even hear, really. Unless I'm deep in a trance or like deep in a sort of dreamlike state. I don't really get those. But it's visual. And then when you say ego state, that kind of feeling of being where you were, like, it's very difficult to put into words.
Yeah.
You know, when you like move into a new house and the new house has a nice feeling to it, and then you go on holiday and you have a holiday feeling.
Yeah.
That's the feeling I get.
Yeah. Or, for example, maybe this will resonate with a lot of people. When you move to a different house, and let's say you dream about your childhood house or about your grandparents' house that you used to hang out in. Like, I find that dreaming about those things kind of put you in the same ego state in a dream, which is on itself is very helpful when doing this sort of work. Yeah,
definitely. Okay, so moving on to point 4. Do not suppress memories of personal failings unless they are disturbing. This is a caveat for the whole process. Do not attempt it or immediately stop it if you have an adverse reaction or feel that any emotions constellated are too difficult. There's kind of 2 bits in there I guess we could talk about. If we touch on the latter one, about things coming forward that say are emotionally troubling, that is a very important caveat, and I think it frames the whole exercise as not a creed and not a dogma. I'm talking purely for self-development purposes here. It's like one doesn't have to complete their analysis of their personal myth perfectly before they can move forward with life.
No.
Such a thing is definitely a trap, because you just see libido withdraw completely away from the world while you sit there for the next 25 years analysing everything. You're like, I understand myself now. Yeah, but you're now, however, about 25 years older than you were before. So, I've seen it with other people, and I've seen it with myself, where certain things in the past can leap forward, and it can almost rattle you a little bit. But the purpose of the unconscious is for homeostasis, really, and adaptation. So if it's going to keep those memories away so you can keep moving forward in the world, that sounds like a good idea to me. So if anything does become troubling, definitely stay away for a while, at the very least.
Yeah, until I find that by doing that, sometimes you will find that those troubling memories do come forward again, and they are less intense, and you're able to have a look and analyze them in a more easier and manageable way sometimes. But if you have to put it off completely, that's also fine.
I remember, I don't know if you resonate with this, Yuliya, but I remember as a little kid, if I would do something embarrassing, as everybody does, I would consciously repress that memory. Rather than suppress, in sort of the unconscious sense, I'd repress it and be like, no, don't want it, no, don't.
Yeah.
Some of those came forward. I was going through this process a while ago, or as I've been doing this process really for about 2 years now. They'd come forward. I could deal with them a little bit better than I did as a kid, but it doesn't make them any easier.
No.
Even though, say, life's moved forward like 20 years, they still sort of sit there and sting. It's like, oh, I shouldn't have said that because you got upset at me. It still sits there and it hurts. And obviously things can get more serious than that, and they do get more serious than that. But, when the time is right, then the time is right to process such things.
That's true, and it reminds me these memes that you see on the internet of there's going to be a very sad girl or guy sitting there crying in the middle of the night, and then there's going to be a little text saying, thinking of that one stupid thing you said 20 years ago.
That's it. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's what, the psyche's given an invitation to meme man or meme woman, and pretty much that's it. But on the first part of point 4, then, do not suppress memories of personal failings unless they are disturbing. I think, if one only looked at the positive things that happened, they'd be living in an inflated fantasy land.
Yeah.
It's like you were born, everything was wonderful, even about one's own character, and it's only environmental influences, purely in any one given moment, that knocked one off track. And really, you're meant to be a superhero of some kind. Because I've seen that with a lot of people. A lot of people. People make mistakes. It is what makes us human. And that's okay.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of times these memories are very instructive.
Yeah.
For your analysis of your personality, of your life, of who you were and where you were going, where you are going. So this can be hugely helpful, unless it feels traumatizing.
Yeah.
Then in that case, it's better to put it away for a little bit.
Yeah.
But other than that, I find it very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think on the surface, something like that looks like an obvious point. Well, of course, I look at my failings. But when you're going through the process, it's much more difficult to look at those things.
It's not easy.
All it takes is a small switch of consciousness to go, no, I'll look away from that, and I'll look away from that, and look away from that. And if one doesn't, it's really where the moral complex, or complexes in general, can rush forward and create an unnecessary mess of the process in that moment, again, from what I've seen. So that's why I think this point so far maybe brings into context the necessity to have the whole guide in front of oneself. This is the preliminary outline at the beginning to give sort of a primer for what's going to take place. But then there's hundreds of pages of very important practical theory, which have to be there. And then at the end, there's all of this in much greater detail, but it has to be there. Without an understanding theoretically of complexes, I don't know if one can do an honest personal myth.
Yeah.
We can pass the phone. You can do point 5.
Point 5. You will have uncovered your personal myth about your life and who you are. A myth in the sense that is a living, reflexive and autobiographical narrative, and in that which Jung meant where he said that people cannot tell the truth about themselves in an objective way. This is the truth of ourselves that sits at the very heart of our ego and its self-complex.
The nuance of that statement can't be... We have to go into that. There's so much in there. It's not as if a personal myth is a lie. It's a myth, It's not true in a scientific sense. Because how can one do that? Pick any memory and it's like, well, what happened? All one knows is from their point of view what they were feeling, and from their understanding of relating as such, what was going on. It's not the same thing as scientific truth. It's with the human experience at that level, I really think it's where science just goes, and it can't go any further. By definition of the methodology, even Bacon would have known that. The guy who really came up with this stuff, or cemented it in the first place. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, though, in general, about it being a myth rather than it being a true account per se.
Yeah, I find it extremely important, and I think a word myth shouldn't put anyone off from taking this exercise seriously. And that is because even in societies, every person to some extent contributes individually to the whole progress, to where we're going as a society, as people, as a humanity. That's what's been happening since the beginning of times. And nowadays, there are still many things that cannot be explained scientifically. And this is just something that is still in progress. And bit by bit, every human contributes to it. And that's why I think that a life of every person and every personal myth is important. So this just makes me think about the value of life, of each individual, and makes me think about how important it is for people to recognize that their personal myth is important.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And it also makes me think about importance of taking back the power of knowing who you are rather than relying on other people telling you who you are.
Yeah. So it's very humanistic of you, like genuinely so. So I was thinking there, how do I best debate the science complex? Having gone through a lot of that stuff myself, it's like there's simple answers to that. Look at the history of science, how it came about, etc. But there are a lot of people today who believe that everything should be explained through a scientific lens. But outside of a lab, a scientist is not a scientist. They're a human being. Exactly as you're saying, since the dawn of time, that's been the human experience.
This reminds me of, in general, about creativity. Because you can't really make art scientific. You can theorize about it, about different proportions and colors, when we're talking about visual arts, for example, or about music. But really what it is connecting to your own creativity and telling a story from within. And then possibly it's gonna result in something beautiful and something that evokes emotions and make people reflect and change on the inside and inspire. In a similar way, less in the way how it touches other people, but more about how it touches yourself.
Yeah.
I think personal myth is a very creative process. It puts you right back to who you are, right back to your soul, and let things emerge from within.
It is
very important.
It is. It's one of the. I think it's one of the most popular topics we talk about in the IPSA seminars with Carla 2 and 3 each week around creativity, and how again there's a section in the Personal Myth Guide all about creativity, and I remember it begins because it's such an important statement to understand. Begins with creativity is relating. It's creativity is the product of the engagement with life. Doesn't have to be good. Doesn't have to have merit or anything like that. So I'm almost feeling like I'm trying to anticipate in the background, and this is from my own story, my own personal myth, if you like, those previous influences on me that would have restricted that living sense of creative relating within myself. I had the science on the one side as a creed. Where, when science was created, or really when it was formalised about 500 years ago, 400 years ago, Francis Bacon, the Baconian method, it was meant to bring something good to mankind, not to reduce the human experience down to what these days appears to be more of a nihilistic, mechanistic explanation for everything. But then on the flip side, you've got the more woo-woo stuff that comes in to do away with science completely. And to say, or even more sort of postmodern spheres to go, it's all just relative and there's nothing that matters. What matters is in the here and now, is one suffering or are they not? That's a marker one cannot argue with. And it's like this, it cuts straight to the heart of all of it. It anticipates almost along the way the complexes and goes, no, I see you for what you are. Sorry if that was a bit of a rant about stuff.
No,
I can almost feel those things from the past sort of coming forward.
I find it's very helpful, and from what I can remember, on the last seminar you mentioned that as growing up, you were basically cut away from creativity and everything that has to do with creative by a school system.
I think most
because
people
it was more scientifically oriented.
Yeah, I think most people are in school, at least in the UK, growing up sort of in the first 2 decades of the 2000s. Creativity was... One, if you were academic, you by default weren't creative. That was the first thing. And I was much more academic. So art class, whatever, it's like, it's not for me. Music, not for me. I can't do that. You see the complexes there, like an 11-year-old forming. It's like, what? So that's one thing. But then also creativity has merit put, in terms of do you get an A or an A star in your exam. Merit is put as that driving force behind why one should be creative in the first place. It's like, that should just be stripped away. School for stuff like that is a disaster. At least the schools I went to. And I think that's a universal experience, more or less, for people of, say, my generation growing up here.
Point 6. On the positive side, it gives us a mirror within which to reflect upon our most fundamental sense of ego identity and our values, especially those we cannot give up.
You know what this reminds me of straight away?
What?
Yes, and this is speaking about the demographic from which I came, if you like. What was one like before they encountered gurus on the internet? That was such a useful thing for myself to bear in mind, to try and strip away a lot of that stuff. What's your ego identity? Because lots of things that people pick up are outside of themselves that lead to further maladaptation.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of things like nofap and red pill and whatever, usually things involving a man's sexuality.
Yeah, it's reinforcing complexes.
Yeah, so who was one before they picked up those ideas? That's not to say you have to do away with every idea one's learned. It's not to say that at all. And if that's an idea that comes forward, what might be driving that to disengage one from the process? It's like forensic thinking around a complex and stuff like that. But who was one before they encountered a certain character or ideas? Because that's more them than ideas than they've learned.
That's true. Point 7. On the negative side, the through line of our personal myth also uncovers all of our neuroses, inflexibilities, maladaptations, and personal failings, even our shadow. More on the specific of this later.
Yes. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but it's important, I think, to emphasise again, isn't it? It's like when one goes through the shadow of memory, it's not just all sunshine and roses. I think that's a relatively obvious thing, but it all comes down to the doing of it, doesn't it? So when you're really encountering yourself, not in an inflated pop Jungian sense, where I encounter the self or something, and it's one that one can't describe, one can't feel, and all that kind of all the pop Jungian stuff. When the real personal development stuff comes in, insofar as one's actually done it themselves, when they truly sit and look at themselves in the mirror, it's like warts and all, and everything they've done wrong, they've hurt other people, and everything else, and it's not pleasant to look at.
No.
But it's needed.
It's not pleasant, but it gives you the full story about yourself, and it gives you the power of knowing who you are, what you can do. It gives you the tools of understanding what you can do to adapt better in the future, what you did wrong that caused you feeling negatively about this or that.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult exercise. Very challenging, but immensely useful.
It is. I think that point reframes, I won't even say that, I'll say this point is what makes the personal myth different to other, say, self-development methods that one might find on the internet in the starkest form so far, I think. Because the self-development on the internet is, well, how can one build as much muscle as possible? How can one pick up as many girls as possible? How can one become a hustling Twitter guru and make $1 million a month off of drop shipping? Whatever it happens to be. The standard memes one will find. One can call that self-development if they want to. But self-development in self-development is who are you as a person. And it changes the focus away from Adlerian status, pretty much, which is what those other online spheres might discuss, and instead shifts it onto relating. What's your story? What's it going to be? And fundamentally, I think something that's not really emphasised in those spheres online, which I worked in for a few years, is actually being a nicer person, being a warmer person, being a more genuine person, those day-to-day little bits and pieces, rather than instilling other bits of complexes into one's head. So when I mentioned earlier that one of the first things I thought of immediately was I'm a hard worker. It's like, to what end? To what end? When I was a kid, 3-4 years old, was that what I was? A hard worker? Maybe. Maybe I was fairly conscientious as a kid, but that wasn't the point of me. Maybe that should be used towards something that my libido wants to go towards, in a relational, social sense. It's those little small reframe questions I think are important to say.
But even with something as a hard worker, I'm wondering if that can be applied to anyone, or is it or is that the person can say I'm a hard worker, but mostly applicable to 1 or 2 or 3 specific spheres. You know what I mean? So I think when it comes to points like that, when people think about who they are, what are their core values and traits, I think when something like I'm a hard worker comes up, one should look behind and be like, so what was I interested in all the way?
That's it, yes.
What is it that's driving me? What do I like to work on so far?
Yeah.
You know, is it hard work in an office?
Yeah.
Is it going to a gym and working very, very hard in the gym? You know, and then once you answer that question, I think a good question to ask yourself is it why?
Yeah.
And basically keep asking yourself questions until you feel that you found that core value or a trait of yours.
Oh yeah. The Stoics are quite popular online in masculine self-development spheres these days. And maybe bring it back further and say, what about Socrates and the Socratic dialogue and that continuing of asking why within oneself? Why? That's the point, isn't it? Rather than I am Stoic, I am hard worker, I am this. The whole point of this is to say exactly as you're saying, Yuliya, what for? Who, where is it going? All that kind of stuff. You know, if one was to say, you know, I another one I had as well when I was growing up was I am an atheist. I actually remember a moment, about 18 or so, where I had that. I remember I can't remember where I was thinking to myself, I don't know who I am, where I'm going, but I do know that I am an atheist. And it's like,
so that's one thing that you know about yourself.
well, that was one thing apparently, that I knew about myself. But then questioning it, it's like, okay, maybe, thought experiment, maybe this is sitting here, this idea of atheism in consciousness as a symbol for something that's unconscious. Classic sort of substitution there.
Maybe.
And I went, I tracked my religious interests, if you like, over time up to that point, and was like, oh, it's Freud. It's all Freud. It's all Freud, just staring right out, instead of going on an Adlerian quest of I am an atheist. And we know the types; they're quite common in that way. It's not to say one shouldn't do that. It's not a moral judgment. But if one wants to take the exercise seriously, they have to question these things.
Yeah. Point 8. Around the through line, we'll gather external mythological motives and beliefs, religious and political, for example, but also symbolic narratives of culture such as films, novels, and all fantasy products of culture that have a sympathetic resonance with our through line.
This has been a wonderful thing you talked about recently in the Sunday seminars with Cardinal One. Steve and Pauline presenting their clinical methodology around utilising a patient's fantasy life as a way in to the psyche. And it's so exciting to do that. It's so exciting. Just to think to oneself, their favourite book or their favourite movie or their favourite video game is relevant.
Yeah.
It's not a distraction in the strict sense, but it's relevant at that, say, sympathetic resonance level. I still find that exciting now. Like right now, thinking about it.
Because if you think about it, movies and books and music that we like, it is one thing that you cannot fake.
No, you can't. You
can't really fake your taste for things. It might develop for some reasons, now that I think about it, but it is going to be that way in, which is going to help you to answer questions about yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like it's the most exciting, the most interesting, and would you say it's the easiest way in?
I defer to Steve and Pauline on that. It was definitely the easiest way in with me. And I was open on the channel again about this too. The way in I found to myself was, say, a particular memory that stood out to me always, but then also my interest in the Divine Comedy by Dante. Even just thinking about it would go, it's like an electric something. And it wasn't the method that the writings around hell or anything like that. The standard stuff one might think of with Dante. It was the character of Beatrice in that story. And as I say, I've made a few videos on it before on this channel, spoken about it in other podcasts with the students, but that was so useful for within myself getting a grounding on what instincts in myself needed to be expressed properly. That's not to say one should get distracted by such things, though. You know, especially with something like Dante or something from the so-called Western canon. There's so much cultural suggestion and power around them that, you know, I think it's one of the reasons why Steve is emphasizing this point, is one can get themselves contained by an outside myth. I am Dante and the world is hell and I'm looking for my Beatrice. It's like, no, Beatrice was a girl, we don't know very much about her, who died, unfortunately, she was very young, and Dante didn't really know her. In many ways, he misappropriated her. Or the Victorian authors who rediscovered him outside of Italy 150 years ago misappropriated her through talking about him too much. That kind of thing. What was Dante doing? What instincts in him am I resonating with? So that whatever he did, I can do a similar thing at the instinct level, but it's my story. That kind of thing. It's so exciting. To me, it's so exciting. Music as well is another one. It's just, you can't argue with music. You can try it, you can't do it.
Yeah, music is a very good one. But you know what? Being in a completely different environment, growing up and up until now, I would say, I wasn't that much in touch with that strictly scientific sphere and people in general. So I'm wondering, when you have someone very scientifically minded, you know, very theoretical, very dry in that sense, can you use creative outlets like that to access your personal myth if you're like that, if you're very scientific? I'm just thinking if you can think of maybe your classmates in the past in university, or just people, professors, maybe the people that you know.
Well, I would look at those people and see that their proficiency in science was just simply a positive trait about them, but not explanatory of all of them as a human being. They might believe themselves to be, just like I did in the past. I am just a collection of atoms, and everything that I see is photons hitting my eye, and we're all going to decay eventually, and life is all pointless. And that's not saying that's what science does. This is, I think everyone knows the type of person we're talking about, that cultural complex. You know, emotion is the way into anybody, regardless if they're a scientist or not. You know, it's why a scientist in a lab might be a scientist, but outside of the lab with their headphones in, they're a rock star as far as they're concerned. You know, it sounds funny like that, but it's true.
Yeah.
You know, they're resonating on a human level with more of their personality. It's like music seems to be, and this is something from speaking to Steve and Pauline and reading a little bit of Jung and stuff like that. It's like music is the movement of energy and information in the unconscious. It's like a resonance. And to be honest, I don't even want to explain it. It feels so good to listen to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like if you try to explain it, you take away magic from it or something.
To some degree, yeah. And that reminds me of something Richard Feynman says. The science complex is coming out today. You know, how he thought that science could be beautiful in explaining things. You know, when there's a famous debate with him and a priest, where Feynman was talking about a leaf, and how if you break down a leaf, you go down into the cells, and then the organelles within the cells, and the molecules and the atoms, and it's like poetry down there. And the priest arguing, going, no, you're taking all the magic out. Really sort of looking at that on the outside. It's like, it's whatever the ideas are being used by is the important part. Not the science, not the religion, it's the human experience underneath. Because either can be used by pernicious things in the psyche to pull one away from who they were meant to be. And I'm rambling off on a different point here, bringing that science complex out.
No, just thinking about a leaf, you know, that's it's true that it can take the magic away, but it can also add a magic, thinking about how complex things are, and how much more things there are that we don't see, that are like the processes that are happening. It's so beautiful.
Oh yeah.
Think about it. It's beautiful.
Oh yeah, the quantum biology of photosynthesis is like one big electric current. It's an electrical machine, but it's alive. You know? I quite like that, but it depends on what viewpoint someone's taking. It's like what's driving it underneath, and that's the important thing with stuff like this. Again, it's back to the person, back to what one's own perception, experience, processing, relating is all about. All right, point 9. Be reflexive. This does not mean analytical in a one-sided, for example, introverted thinking function sense. It means using evaluative capacities in equal measure to analysis. See yourself in the context of when you came into consciousness as a ready-made being. Now, I think this really shows the difference between a biography and a personal myth. Don't you, Yuliya?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's one thing to lay out all the memories and all the events that happened to you. And I think going back, or you can also do it simultaneously as you write about it, and analyze, think, and reflect upon what happened, how different people influenced you, is going to tell you a lot of different things that you didn't know.
Yeah, it's a biography, an autobiography as one layer, and then the depth psychology is put on top as a process, but you never lose sight of you in the middle of it. Okay, so point 10. From your earliest memory, if it is in early childhood, run the thought experiment reflexively. Who was I before that memory? Did I exist prior to my being able to fix a time and a place defined by the memory? Did you exist before your first memory, Yuliya?
I think I did.
I hope you did.
The photographs prove that I did exist before that.
That's true. True. Yeah, but obviously we don't know who we were from like a feeling point of view. That's when we can sort of peer around the corner. You know, before there was ego consciousness, and this is in the personal myth guide too, before there was ego consciousness, there was still you as a person. I mean, even way at the moment of conception, there's still a you. It's a genome and it's a single cell, a zygote, but it's still you, with potential going forward. So it's like, what's in there? What's in the genome? What's its intentionality? Asking such questions grounds one immediately in, I think, all the base theory they need to get a standing on. You know, and as we said, there's this more scientific worldview, there's a woo-woo worldview, all these different things. But if one bears in mind, there's a genome with intentionality, so genome, instinct, affect, and then consciousness on top. I think one can sort of lean back on that. Be like, you know, from what one knows of depth psychology, the ego's not in control. You're moved forward by those things that you're not in control of, but the ego has executive action. One of the things it can do is look back and go, wait a minute. That's what I'd read into that point by Steve there. Steve then carries on and says, you will of course immediately realise that you did exist. You were a biological, a psychological and a social entity, an individual with an identity relevant to others before your sense of self as established by your earliest memory was laid down. That's it. So we're moving on to point 11 then. Working on your shadow. This is only a starting point. The shadow needs very careful explication, but for now reflect on this. Around the through line gathers all that you are, emerging as an unfolding process of a priori characteristics that develop into the conscious, remembering self that is your ego today. Around it also gathers every personal failure, every dark inclination, every contrary moral, every contravened ethic. The neurotic alibis, the guiding fictions and false narratives that have defined you equally as much as your triumphs and higher values. Reflect on these two oppositely charged poles, the adaptive and the maladaptive. Evaluate them in terms of the core of your personal myth. Use the result to check yourself against yourself and reach even deeper into the roots of your being, around the very central axis of your through line, where you will find not only your past, but the intended teleological goal of your life's trajectory. I think, to be honest, that's fairly self-explanatory. I think the best thing to do with point 11 is to defer the guys to our videos on the shadow, on the Jung To Live By channel. And I say that because the shadow is very confusing in the way it's discussed online, usually. And so if one approaches the personal myth guide with an understanding of the shadow as that part of them that wishes to kick their dog, or whatever, you know, and that sounds like a straw man, but it's not. It's really the way things are described online. As you'll know as well from your Jungian analysis, talked about before on the channel. I think going to those videos first, and then moving forward with quote-unquote shadow work would be the best thing to do. So then finally, on point 12, a personal myth is not a collective myth. Introjecting a collective myth of any kind may help you close in on your personal myth, but it may also conceal it, or divert you away and into a guiding fiction or neurotic alibi. The true progression is personal myth, personal equation, then the path to individuation. I spoke a little bit earlier about collective myths and why one shouldn't contain themselves within them. It's a real shame. It's like handing one's own soul and potential away. But this idea of personal myth to personal equation, then to individuation, I think sums things up really, really nicely. Again, it's almost like a formula one can almost hold on to. The end point of a personal myth, and really it's kind of like the end point that one can do at any point of the process. They can sort of tap out for a moment and take an audit of what they've done so far, is that personal equation. And Steve's described it to myself privately and in a recent IPSA seminar as standing in front of a cliff face. So that's your future coming forward. And you look on your tool belt. There's this and this and this, all the tools that you need to climb that cliff face. It's not everything. It's not the entirety of the self-concept dumped into the Miller number of the ego to go, I know everything about myself, and then you can move forward. You've laid out your self-concept, you understand it. At any one time, most of it's unconscious, you know, because it's not sitting in your mind at all times, every memory, but you've got everything you need to move forward. And that's the point. It's not a disappearing into a reminiscing or into a fantasy. It's what have you left behind in the sands of time that's you and is useful for moving forward. Maybe that will help clear up a maladaptation. Maybe that would help you feel better about yourself in whatever way it happens to be, which is most, if not all, of the reason why people turn to online self-development in the first place.
Yeah.
I think those 12 points sum it up perfectly. From what I've seen. That's all I can really say.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. I really, really enjoyed this chat today.
Me too.
And I hope that our viewers enjoy it too and find it useful.
Yeah, hopefully, especially in these difficult times, one might say. Be very careful what one says on YouTube these days. If people have found the material in this video useful, we'd highly encourage you to check out the full Personal Myth Guide. As you said earlier on today, those 12 points are there as like a primer and something to check back on as one goes through the journey. But one needs to understand, at the very least, really complexes, I think, before they can embark on such a quest. And I think some of the stuff we've talked about today around different belief systems sums that up. And you can even see in me things from the past coming up. It's almost like an echo of like things that would knock me off moving forward with who I am. Nonsense one has picked up. And that's it. One has to be prepared for such a thing when they go into, quote unquote, the unconscious. So if you guys are interested, we'd highly encourage you to check it out. But thanks, Yuliya. Let's do it again.
Thank you.